Alright, in this video we're going to be talking about adding and subtracting with fractions. Now, in this one we're going to be adding and subtracting with fractions where our sum or difference is positive. So before we begin, let's talk about fractions. Now this one right here is a proper fraction. What makes it a proper fraction? Our numerator is less than our denominator. That's a proper fraction. So if it's not a proper fraction, it could be an improper fraction. So what's an improper fraction? It's where the numerator is greater than the denominator. This is an improper fraction. And last we have, a mixed number, where we have a whole number and a fraction. Okay, so we have a proper fraction, improper, where the numerator is greater than the denominator, and then a mixed number, which is the last. Okay. All right. So we're going to start easy. So if I have 1/2 plus 1/2, now as you guys know, the most important thing in when adding or subtracting fractions is that we have to have a common denominator. So they both have 2 as a denominator, so we have a common denominator. So when that happens, you do not add the denominators. Denominator stays the same. You add your numerators. 1 plus 1 is 2. That gives us 2 over 2. Now, every time you have a fraction, whether it's multiplying, dividing, adding, or subtracting with fractions, any operations with fractions, you need to simplify your fraction. I definitely can simplify 2 over 2 because 2 divided by 2 is 1, and that is my answer. So my answer to 1/2 plus 1/2 is 1, which makes sense. If I had half of a pizza and we had another half of a pizza, we would have a whole pizza. Okay, let's look at the next one. I have 1/2 plus 1/3. Now this one I definitely don't have. I'm going to erase everything. I don't have a common denominator. I'm going to go ahead and cross this out because we're done with this problem. I'm going to start this up here. So when finding common denominator, I'm going to list 2 and 3. I'm looking for the least common multiple. Now, technically I can find any common multiple, but the least common multiple is usually easiest to work with because you're going to have the least amount of simplifying to do. So 2, 4, 6, 8, just listing multiples. 10, I'm going to stop there. 3, 6, 9. And if I look here, I have a common multiple in 6. I could have kept going to 12 and 6 and 12. That's another common multiple. Let's stick with 6. So, now at this point, I have 6 and 6. So, what I'm asking myself is, how did I go from 2 to 6? That's right, times 3. 2 times 3 is 6. Now the property of 1 is whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. Whatever you do to the denominator, you do to the numerator. So 1 times 3 is 3. Now I'm going to ask, how did I go from 3 to 6, sorry. That's right, times 2. And whatever you do to the denominator, you do to the numerator, and 1 times 2 is 2. So this is my equivalent addition problem. This is equivalent to 1/2 plus 1/3. But I had to do that because I needed to find common denominator so I could actually add them up. And this would work for adding or subtracting. You always have to have a common denominator. Okay? Once I'm at this point, I can add. 3 plus 2 is 5, and 6 plus 6, that's right, it's 6 because the denominator does not change, and that is my answer, 5 over 6. So when I start off with 1/2, and I cannot simplify it. So when I start off with 1/2 plus 1/3, I find my common denominator, and again, you list your multiples, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 3, 6, 9, 12, and again, my first common multiple was 6, and then all you're asking is, how do I go from 2 to 6? How do I go from 3 to 6? And don't forget, whatever you do to the bottom, whatever you do to the denominator, you do to the top, the numerator. Okay. Once I'm at that point, I add the fractions. Denominator never changes. And at the end, I check to see if I can simplify my fraction or my answer, and in this case, I could not. All right, on this we're going to add two mixed numbers. So let's add 3 1/4 and 3 1/2. Now, common denominator. Now, 4 and 2 is easy because I know 2 will go into 4. So it's 3. And I know 4 is my common denominator. How did I go from 2 to 4? Times 2. Whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. And 1 times 2 is 2. Once I'm at this point, I have common denominator, so I add my whole numbers first. 3 plus 3 is 6. 4 plus 4 is 4 because the denominator does not change. And then 1 plus 2 is 3. And that is my answer because I cannot simplify 3/4. So again, if I'm adding mixed numbers or improper fractions or proper fractions, always find the least common denominator. Don't forget, if I have to find equivalent fractions, whatever I do the bottom, I do the top. Whatever I do the top, I do the bottom. Once I'm at that point, if it's mixed numbers, add your whole numbers together, add your fractions, and then simplify if needed. So 6 3/4 is my answer. Now let's do 4 3/8 plus 4 3/4. And I have common numerators, and that's great, but I need common denominators. So again, this one's easy because I know 4 will go into 8. So I'm going to write this above so that this is going to stay the same because 8 is my common denominator plus 4. I know 8's on the bottom denominator. How do I go from 4 to 8? Times 2, whatever you do to the denominator, you to the numerator, and 3 times 2 is 6. Now, at this point, I have a common denominator, so I can add them. 4 plus 4 is 8. And my denominator is 8 plus 8 is 8 because the denominator does not change. Now I add my numerators. 3 plus 6 is 9. Now that is my answer, but the problem with this is I can simplify this because it's a mixed number with an improper fraction. So what do I do at this point? Well, I'm going to forget my whole number for now, and I'm going to simplify 9 over 8, improper fraction. If you forgot how to do this, top in, bottom out, divide the numerator by the denominator. Okay, 8 will go into 9 one time. 1 times 8 is 8. Subtract. I get 1. So the 1, my remainder becomes my new numerator. So I have 1. My denominator, let me change that to green, might be a little easier to see. My denominator does not change. It was 8. It's still going to be 8. And my quotient up here, the 1, see if I can write this. The 1 up here, what do I do with the 1? The 1 is a whole number, and I add it to my whole number I already had. So 1 plus 8 is 9. So that is my answer. I like to think of this as change. 9/8 is more than $1 worth of change. So if I got that change, if I didn't want to carry around so much change, and I converted that, some of that change, if I had more than $1 into dollar bills, this 1 would have been an extra dollar bill. I add it to the $8 bills I already had in my pocket. So now I have $9 and some change left over. Again, forget that 8. Work on the improper fraction. Divide the numerator by the denominator. 9 divided by 8 is 1 and 1/8. So you add that 1 to the whole number you already had, and so you get 9 and 1/8, and that is your answer, and you can't simplify it anymore. All right. Last thing we're going to do on this lesson is subtract a couple fractions. Again, adding and subtracting, the rules still work the same. Have to find the least common denominator. So I have 1 1/2 minus 3/4. Now this one's easy because I can find a common denominator pretty easy. I know 2 will go into 4, so 1 2/4 minus 3/4. Now the problem with this is I can't take 3 from 2. Technically I could and have a negative in my numerator, but that's just messy. So when I come to this, I'm going to borrow, which technically on this one we're just really converting the 1 2/4 into an improper fraction. How do I turn a mixed number into an improper fraction? So we're going to multiply denominator by the whole number. Whatever our product is, we're going to add that to our numerator, and the denominator stays the same. So I'm add 4 times 1 is 4, plus 2 is 6. So it's 1 2/4 is the same thing as 6/4 minus 3/4. And our difference, our answer is 3/4 because we cannot simplify that. So what this means, if I were to subtract 1 1/2 by 3/4, I'm going to get an answer of 3/4. Again, as final least common denominator, I can't take 3 from 2, so I had to borrow or turn my 1 2/4 into an improper fraction. Then I can subtract the fractions because I have common denominators. And I can take 3 from 6, and so my answer is 3/4. All right. Last problem we're going to do in this lesson is 3 1/2 minus 3 3/4. Now, I lied. Let's make this 4 1/2. Let's make this 4 1/2. Otherwise, we would have had our difference would have been negative, and we'll get to that in another lesson. All right, so 4 1/2 minus 3 3/4. So what am I going to do here? So, let's find our common denominators, 4 2/4, because I know 2 will go into 4, minus 3 3/4. Similar to the last problem with this, I can't take 3, my numerator, from 2. So what I usually encourage my students to do is to borrow. Borrow from the whole number. Borrow like you've been taught how to borrow in a normal subtraction with whole numbers, with decimals. Work similar to this. So I'm going to erase some of this. So we have 4 2/4, and I'm going to write it above. 4 2/4, and show you how to borrow. I'm going to borrow from the 4. The 4 becomes a 3. Then, how do I write 1 as a fraction? Well, for this particular problem, I'm going to write it 4 over 4. Why? Because 4 is my common denominator. And then I'm going to add the 2/4. Where did I get the 2/4? Right here. Where did I get the 4 over 4? Well, I borrowed from the 4. How do you write 1 as a fraction? Well, when I borrowed from the 4, this became 3. How do I write 1 as a fraction? 4 over 4, because 4 divided by 4 is 1. If I added that back, 1 plus 3 is 4. And then I have my two fractions, and that gives me 3 6/4 minus 3 3/4. Now, at this point, I can subtract them because I have a common denominator, and I can take 3 from 6. So 3 minus 3, my whole numbers, is 0. Technically, I don't even need to write that. And then 6/4 minus 3/4 is 3/4. So my answer of 4 1/2 minus 3 3/4 is 3/4. So I hoped this helped with adding and subtracting fractions. Again, always know your parts of the fraction, numerator, denominator, what types of fractions they are. Always have to find a common denominator and make sure and simplify at the end. And sometimes on subtracting fractions, you'll either have to turn your mixed numbers into improper fractions, or sometimes you can borrow to find the difference to find the answer. So again, I hope this helped, and if you have any questions, you can email me at jhewlett@leisd.ws. Thanks.